I'd got a message I was going to share this morning, and to be honest, it was more a title than a message, and I got some ideas, and it's something that I'll probably touch on a little bit today, but I really felt God was changing it up a little bit, as he quite often does. He likes to change things. We've obviously got one left. God likes to change things around a little bit sometimes, and the message that I really felt he was delivering this morning was from the verse in Hebrews 12. It's one that we know quite well, and one that I quoted just a couple of minutes ago. And I would entitle this message, "The Author and the Finisher." And I wanted to start, you can turn to Matthew 26 if you've got your Bibles, while I chat for a couple of minutes. But I wanted to start by just sort of asking a bit of a question. Is there anyone in the room who is really good at finishing a job that they've started? Some of you are really good, some of you are going, no, I'm laughing because I just know that I'm not. I've got to be honest, I'm not very good at finishing a job that I start either. I'm really enthusiastic when I start it most of the time. And then about 2/3 of the way through, I'm just fed up. And it's just like, you know what, maybe it's time to start the next one. This is mainly the reason why I have a 2/3 built guitar that's hanging up on my wall. This is mainly the reason that I know how to play 3 songs on a cello. This is mainly the reason for a lot of things, is that I'm very good at starting something, but not so good at finishing it. And you know what? I found it very interesting that as I was reading through this passage in Matthew 26, and I realised I told you all to turn there, and I didn't put my bookmark there this week, so I shall turn at the same time. But as I was reading through this passage in Matthew 26, I realised that Jesus had an opportunity to choose. He had an opportunity to choose whether he would be a finisher or just a starter. He started a work, we read that in the beginning of the Gospels, that he came to earth to do something. He came with a purpose. If you don't know what that purpose was, ask someone next to you, they'll tell you. After the service, not now. He came with a purpose, but he had a choice about whether he finished it. And it's probably not something that we would consider a choice, but I certainly read it as a choice. And it says this, we are looking, I will get the right verse in just a second. Someone's hidden it. There we go, 36. I think I heard someone muttering 36 over there. Thank you very much. So we're going to read from verse 36. It says this, "Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, 'Sit here while I go and pray over there.' And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me.' He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.' Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, 'What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, 'Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done.' And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the 3rd time, saying these same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners.'" I'm going to stop there. The choice that I see that Jesus had is not so much a choice of whether he went through with dying on a cross or not. I think Jesus kind of already knew that that was going to happen. He didn't really have much of a choice. The choice that was going on with Jesus was the war in between the flesh and the Spirit of God within him that said that this is the purpose and the calling that you were created for. And the flesh which was saying, "I really don't want to die." I think most of us would have the same flesh cry in that situation, is, "I really don't want to die." And so Jesus is having this battle going on. And I love the fact that Jesus brings 3 of his closest disciples with him to help him through this time. But I really feel sorry for Peter a little bit. Because as you read through this, Jesus goes off and leaves them and tells them to pray. And as he comes back, Peter's asleep and the rest of them are asleep. And Jesus kind of rebukes them a little bit and says, can't you even stay awake for an hour? Now, the reason I feel sorry for Peter is they just had the Passover meal. Now, we quite often think of this as the communion time where it's a bit of bread and a bit of wine. If you've done a proper Passover meal, it's a feast. Peter had feasted for the last couple of hours. I don't know about you, when I've eaten a lot, I feel like sleeping. I feel like just sort of getting a bit of a kip in. And Jesus turns around to him and says, what on earth are you doing? Why are you asleep? You see, Peter was going through the same war over the flesh and the spirit. Peter wasn't doing such a good job of winning it. And quite often we get in that same place. That we have this constant war in between what our spirit knows we should do and what our flesh really wants to do. And as we war back and forth, Paul talks about it, that he says that those things which I desire to do, I don't do. And those things which I didn't do, those are the things that I keep doing. I really relate to Paul in that sometimes, because I can honestly say that I sit there sometimes and think, I really wish I could do things differently to the way that I do. And yet every day I get up and it seems to happen exactly the same way. It seems that the days just seem to go in a cycle of I get up and it happens the same way as it did before. And then I go to bed and think, you know what, God, I really wish tomorrow will be different. I want to do something different. I want it to be different from the way that I've done it today. And then I get up tomorrow and it happens about the same way as it did before. There's this warring that goes on between the spirit and the flesh. And Jesus had this choice. But I love the fact that Jesus knew what the right answer was from the start. Because Jesus said, God, if it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done. I think so often we get into that same place, but rather than saying, God, if it's possible, take this from me, but not my will, but your will be done. What we say is, God, take this from me, take it now. I can't do it anymore. Get rid of it. We don't say, God, not my will, but your will be done. We say, God, make your will match mine. Because I willed that I would not do this. So please will you will that, so that I don't have to do it. So often we get into that point where rather than saying, God, not my will, but your will be done, we say, God, let my will be your will. But not in the spiritual sense, not in the sense of change my will. We sit there and say, God, change your will. Change your will to fit my will, because my flesh is really telling me that I want to do something different to what you're calling me to do. The prayer is right, but the sentiment is wrong. Not my will, but your will. Should mean, God, not what I desire, but what you desire. Change my will to match your will. You see, in this moment, Jesus had a choice about what he would do, whether he would say, you know what, I know what's going to happen. I really don't like the idea of this. Maybe I just take a quick hike through the back of the woods that he was on in Gethsemane and just sort of disappear out the back. I imagine Jesus could probably do that if he wanted to. He was probably quite good at just disappearing off and no one would know where he'd gone. And he'd just say, you know what, maybe next year, 34 is a good age to live to. Let's try 34 instead. But he knew that the right choice was saying, God, if it's your will, I know that you'll see me through this. The interesting thing is at that moment when he said, God, not my will, but your will be done, things didn't get better. I don't know if you've seen that, if you've read a little bit past this, but he gets arrested, he gets beaten up, he gets tried, he gets beaten up a little bit more, he gets crucified. That to me is not things getting any better. That to me is things getting an awful lot worse. And yet Jesus knew that it wasn't what he wanted to happen, but what God wanted to happen. And it made me wonder, how did Jesus have the resolve to stand there and say, because Jesus was fully man, so he was like us. So there must have been something in him that had a resolve to stand there and say, regardless of this situation, regardless of the circumstances that are going to come, I'm going to do what God's calling me to. And this is where I think this verse in Hebrews 12:2 really comes in. I'm going to turn there. You can turn with me if you like. I'm going to read from verse 1 as well. It says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. There's a really important phrase in there. Looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. The joy was not in the cross. The joy was not in the persecution. The joy was in knowing that death could not have the power over him, and that he would rise over death, and that we would then have a way to the Father through what Jesus did. You see, Jesus had the ability to look beyond what was happening in the now and know that because of what he was willing to do, it would create a way for every single one of us to come into a relationship with God. That was the joy that Jesus found. Not in the moment, not in the now, but in the future, looking beyond where he was at in the present to the things that were to come. And I think so often, certainly for me, the reason I'm not a very good finisher sometimes is because I look at the now. I look at the work that it's going to take. I look at the effort that I've got to put in. I look at the amount that I've got to fight with myself to do something. And I go, okay, let's start something new instead. There's momentum when you start something new. There's momentum when you start something fresh. The finishing of it requires a vision beyond what's now to what will be. For example, when I started building a guitar, I had a load of pieces in a box. There was no pictures that came with the guitar of how to put it together. It was literally a box full of pieces and I had to figure it out. But I knew what a guitar looked like. Looks like one of those, if anyone didn't know. I had a picture in my head of what it could be, even though at the present it wasn't. Now what happens is over time, I started to work on it, it starts to take shape, it starts to look like a guitar. If you go up in my office, you'll see it hanging up. There's a neck on it and everything. It looks kind of like a guitar, but it's not finished. The reason it's not finished is because we lose sight of what we were aiming for in the first place. You see, the problem is it looks very much like a guitar, but it doesn't have any strings on it. It doesn't have a finish on it. It doesn't have any tuning knobs at the top or any electrics wired into it. But the basics of it look like a guitar. I could stand there and say, this is a guitar that I have made. It's almost a guitar, but it's not quite. And how often do we settle for almost what God promised rather than what God actually promised in the first place? How often do we lose sight of the final thing because of the nearly thing that we see now? God, I'm almost there, so that'll do, won't it? God, I've almost done what you've called me to do, so do I really need to finish this last bit? Jesus could have said that. God, I've just spent the last 3 years, I've done everything that you've called me to do, I've reached all the people that you've called me to reach. Is the last 3 hours of my life really that important? 3 years, 3 hours, we're close. But there was something so vital in that last stage that made it worth the pain that he was going to go through, that made it worth the problems and the situations that were coming against him. When I finish my guitar, there is something in that final stage that will make it worth moving beyond where it is now. Mainly that it will make a sound. Because at the minute, all it's good for is a drum, because that's the only sound that it will make, is if you hit it, it will make a sound. You have to have that vision to see beyond the now, to see into the future, to see into what God originally said, and to see that through to completion. I love that the writer of Hebrews says that we look to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. We look to him as an example of how we push through in every circumstance. We look to him as an example of how we see beyond the now and into the things that are to come. And I really want to challenge each one of us as a church that we look beyond the now, that we look beyond the situations that we see, and we look into the future of what is to come. I was graffitiing my coffee cup this morning, and I don't know if people can see it. It's in metallic pen, so it really doesn't show very well. But I drew a little flower in the middle of my coffee cup because I was feeling cheery. I wasn't actually, and that was why I drew the flowers, to try and brighten my day up. But I drew a little flower and I wrote a verse around it, and it says, it's a verse from Corinthians where it says, one plants, another waters, God brings the growth. You know, so often we look at the situation, we see the seed, but we don't see the potential for what that can be. We look at the now rather than the future. And the problem is, if all we see is the seed, or if all we see is the soil that the seed is planted in and we don't see anything growing, we'll neglect it. We won't water it, we won't nurture it. And then we don't see the growth from it. You know, when you bury a bulb in the ground, you can't see it anymore. If you've left it sticking up, it's not going to work. You have to bury it. But what then happens is there's a process that you have to go through of nurturing that, of allowing that to grow and develop, of watering it, of keeping it safe from the elements, so that it can grow into the thing that it was supposed to be in the first place. It hasn't reached its potential as a bulb in the soil. But we have a responsibility to nurture and enable that to grow, to water it, to see it become what God called it to be. And you know, you might look at people around you, and sometimes you don't see the seed. Sometimes you see the dirt, all the muck that they're planted in, but you don't see the seed that's in that person. And that, to me, is the biggest tragedy of church. Is that so often we forget that we were just a seed. So often we forget that there was a time that all anybody saw was the muck that we were in. But someone was willing to nurture us. Someone was willing to water the seed and see us grow. Someone was willing to see us through to the end. And yet the hypocrisy of church can be that when someone else walks in who's covered in dirt, all we see is the dirt. You know, people go through hard times. We've said this today. It's like being surrounded by a pile of manure. But the best things grow from manure. Manure nurtures and fills it with goodness. Even though it seems like an awful thing, it stinks, it looks bad, you don't want to touch it. But what happens, you know, manure is the best thing that you can put around roses because it enables them to grow. And as they grow, it produces the sweetest smelling thing. From the rubbish and the muck that people go through, if we're willing to nurture and allow God to bring the growth, the sweetest smelling thing can come forth. The most wonderful fruit can come forth from something if we're willing to look beyond the rubbish that's going on, if we're willing to look beyond the thing that we see now and look into the future and the potential that that thing has. We have to be willing to look to the finish. We have to be willing to look beyond where things are now to where things can be. And you know what? It takes faith to do that. That's why in this verse it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Because it takes faith to see a seed and know that it can produce fruit. But I don't know about you, have you ever opened up an apple and seen the seeds inside of an apple? Has anybody ever been able to look at a seed inside an apple and say, that one's going to produce a tree, that one's going to do nothing, that one's going to be really, really good, that one's going to be awful? Have any of you ever been able to? I'm no good at that. If you're a seed identifier, then you could have a job at Tesco's or something and rip open apples and tell everyone what the seeds are going to do. Every seed within that apple looks the same and has the same potential, but the ground in which it is planted and the way in which it is nurtured will determine the fruit that it bears. Every single person in this room has the same seed on the inside of them. Because you were saved by the same grace of God and given the same measure of faith. But the way in which it is nurtured will affect the fruit which comes forth. And the problem is, that we look more at our own fruit than the fruit around us. We're more concerned about the fruit that we bear rather than the way in which we can nurture those around us to bear more fruit. It is so vital as a church that we look beyond ourselves. Amen. It is so vital as a church that we look to the people around us. You see that verse in Corinthians says that Paul's talking, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God brought forth the increase. God brought forth the growth. At no point did Paul say, I planted a seed within myself, I watered it myself, and I brought the increase. He didn't even say, I planted a seed in myself and watered it myself, and God brought the increase. He said that I planted a seed in somebody else. Someone else then came along and watered and nurtured that, and God brought the increase in their life. It's outward focused. It's looking beyond oneself to the people around us. Because what happens is if you nurture somebody else's seed, they'll nurture yours, and God will bring the growth and the increase. But as a church, we can so often get focused on bringing our own growth. We try and manipulate that seed within us to grow in any way that we can. We look at how we can gain as much as we possibly can. When really we should be looking at how we can give as much as we possibly can. How we can impart into people as much as we possibly can. How we can share into people's lives as much as we possibly can so that we see the growth come forth in them. It's so easy to judge a person by the situation that they're in. It's so easy to judge a person by the things that you see going on. And yet the only thing that we should look for in a person is the seed of potential that God planted on the inside of them. Because what happens is as that seed grows, as we see that potential in a person, God deals with the rest of the stuff. We're not called to dig out the manure. We're not called to dig out all the rubbish in people's lives. We're called to grow the seed. We're called to plant something within them, water it and nurture it so that it brings forth a harvest. And God does the rest. God deals with the things that he needs to deal with. God deals with the situations that people are going through. And as a church, we should have our focus on how we bring the growth. But the only way that we can do that is to see beyond the now and to see the end picture. Like Jesus did, to see the end, the joy that was set before him, gave him the strength to endure all the stuff that he was going to go through because there was something better to come. There was something greater to come, but it wasn't for him. It was for everybody else. You see, Jesus didn't benefit from dying on a cross. Jesus was a perfect man. If he'd have died of natural causes, he would have gone to heaven. He was the only sinless man on earth. The only reason Jesus died on a cross was for every single one of you. There was no personal gain for Jesus other than the joy of seeing you come back into relationship with God. There was no personal gain for Jesus other than the joy of having a relationship with you. And Jesus knew that that was more than enough for him to stand there and say, God, not my will, but yours be done. Each one of us has a choice to look beyond the now, to look to the future, to look to the promises of God and say, you know what, God, I want to be a finisher. I want to run with perseverance the race that is set before us. But it says in that verse 1, it says, Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off the weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us and run with perseverance the race that is set before us. There's a point where we have to remove the things that hinder us so that we can keep going in what God's called us to. And if you look at that word weight in Hebrews 12, it talks about a mass so heavy that the sides of the vessel are bulging under the weight. It's a very descriptive word. I loved it when I read it and looked it up. It was like, wow. This idea of a weight that is so heavy that it physically makes the sides of the vessel bulge to the point where it can't move. Have you ever seen a video where someone tries to load up a car or a truck and they put so much stuff in it that the wheel arches are touching down on the wheels and the car just literally won't move forward because there's just no way for it to go under that weight? So often, we get so heavy laden with the weight that we're unable to move. We're unable to move forward because it's like our wheels have been locked in place. And it says here, because we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. In other words, not for my benefit, but for the benefit of the people who are looking to me as an example. I will throw off the things that hinder me. I will choose to let go of the flesh and run with perseverance the race that God has set before me. I'll make a choice to say, you know what, God? I don't want to have this war between the flesh and the spirit. I don't want to have this ongoing battle of, God, will you make your will fit mine? We turn and say, God, I want my will to fit yours. I want to see what you see. I want to finish the way that you've called me to finish. I want to do the things that you've called me to do. And I want to see it the way that you see it. Not as an almost nearly there, but as a complete, perfect work, finished in the way that God called it to. And so my question to you guys today, are you a finisher? And my challenge is to see the seed. See the seed in people's lives and nurture it in any way that you can. Give that seed the very best love and attention that you can. Pour your heart into that seed and watch God grow it. Watch God move in people's lives as we love them and care for them, as we nurture them and see them develop into the people that God has called them to be. That's my message this morning. The author and the finisher of our faith.